All right. Welcome back to the Migraine Renaissance podcast. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about several of the different underlying pillars and the whys behind their value in migraine management. So, I think in order to do this, let's start by talking about something called cortical spreading depression. Understanding that there is this rippling wave of neurological activity that sometimes courses through the migraine susceptible brain. This is responsible for a lot of the aura symptoms we have, but it also is theorized to kind of kickstart the pain process with the migraines. So, as the cortical spreading depression ripples through the brain at a very slow, couple millimeters per minute, the trigeminal-vascular system is really the center of the migraine experience. And when the cortical spreading depression reaches this center in the brainstem, it triggers the trigeminal nerve to release a bunch of inflammatory chemicals, most importantly, CGRP and PACAP38. These are the two that have been the most strongly implicated in the migraine process. There's a few other things like mast cell degranulation, which is, kind of like you hear about histamine issues all the time in this kind of population. But recognizing that CGRP and PACAP38 are the most important inflammatory signaling molecules that are driving this migraine process. So those are released out of this trigeminal nerve into the blood vessels surrounding the brain. So in the dura mater, as well as some of the other layers in the coating around the brain. But it also is released in your eyes and in other parts of your face. So that's why sometimes you get that really, really strong light sensitivity when your pupil constricts. The sensitivity is also increasing because of this change in the brain stem and other higher level centers of the brain. So at the thalamus and other pain processing regions. And this is actually responsible for driving some of this inflammatory and chronicity change. So when the inflammation is not really the problem, other than it's the migraine pain itself, but the problem is that this gets worse and worse over time because the brain and the brainstem become sensitized, meaning that, and it actually happens outside of the brain too, in the trigeminal nerve. These structures are becoming more susceptible to signals that your brain then perceives as pain. And so it is a lot easier to basically start having migraines more and more often. So this is basically a process of peripheral and central sensitization. I know that sounds like a kind of mouthful there, but it's really actually important to recognize this is the main issue with long-standing migraine disability. Because let's say you had one migraine, you wouldn't develop any of this sensitization. But as your brain is exposed to repeated bouts of pain over and over and over again, your brain is actually really adaptable. It's called neuroplasticity, and it is able to learn this pain process. So what's happening there is the migraine's triggered, your brain has this huge influx of inflammation and stuff like that, as well as some changes in how certain brain regions are able to talk to each other and the kind of threshold in certain areas of required activity. And so when you have this process starting, the inflammation is released by the trigeminal system. It dilates these blood vessels in your brain really, really wide. So they're both dilated and they're more sensitive to the different stimuli that they might experience, such as changes in blood pressure. And you may have felt this if you ever bend down while you have a headache or a migraine. It often feels like it's a throbbing pressure in, like, usually one side of the head, sometimes across the head. You also may feel some pain in the neck and in the other parts of your face and head because of a really interesting process called cervicotrigeminal convergence, but we'll talk about more of that down the line. And so what's happening is now we've got this big inflammation causing vasodilation, this widening of the blood vessels, and those nerves are really sensitive. This CGRP has now activated and made the trigeminal nerve even more sensitive. So the trigeminal nerve releases this chemical, and then that chemical actually reacts with that same nerve, the trigeminal system, and it reacts on the little finger end pieces of it, the dendrites, as well as some of the closer parts, and most importantly, the trigeminal ganglion, which is the cell bodies of the trigeminal nerve, and that sits closer, like in the inside of the head. And then that nerve then courses into the brainstem through a bunch of little holes in your skull. And once it gets there, it interacts with a bunch of different cells, all of these different brainstem and spinal cord cells. Even actually, the nucleus that this nerve interacts with extends down right into the base of the skull and into the neck. So it interacts with the upper part of the neck. So the C1, 2, and 3, those nerves come together and actually interact with that process. And so that is often why we get some neck pain and stiffness associated with migraines. And that can go both ways. That can be the neck can cause some irritation to the trigeminal system and contribute to exacerbation of migraines, or the trigeminal nerve can actually exacerbate the neck. It can make the neck more likely to be sensitive to certain things because of this big change in inflammation and nerve sensitivity surrounding the CGRP release. So now we follow the pain from, or the nociception is actually what it's called. Not really, pain isn't really felt where the nerves are. That's really more nociception and other sensations that are being delivered to the brainstem and then up to the brain, where they are interpreted as a pain process or as a pain experience. So that process is intimately connected with some other brain regions that are really, really important to know about. The emotional processing regions, the regions where our brain says, you know, this is a threat. We need to motivate ourselves to get out of this, or we need to really, really pay attention to this. The best way to do that is by creating an emotional response. So pain is really intimately connected here. And in people with migraines, we see changes in these emotional processing centers. We see changes in areas that are responsible for dampening the pain experience. So most importantly, like the prefrontal cortex is an area where we exert our kind of higher level thinking to dampen some of this. And a lot of this goes on behind the scenes too. There are pain dampening centers in the brainstem that are also changing in the process of migraines. And so what we need to understand here is that migraines are now kind of viewed as a connectopathy. And that means the differences in the ability for certain brain regions to interact and talk to each other that regulate the pain experience, those go haywire when your brain starts to get more and more sensitive from this repeated migraine stimulus. And so we need to basically unwire that kind of learned process of disconnecting these things, and we need to enhance the connectivity of those brain regions again. How do we do that? First, we need to address the things that are setting your trigeminal system off, that are, initiating this cascade of cortical spreading depression and eliciting that CGRP release from the trigeminal system. So, things to improve the brain connectivity and to decrease inflammation and increase the energy production of the cells and improve their stability are all major players in this migraine management process. We need to improve our brain cells' ability to produce energy, so enhancing their mitochondrial function and making sure that key nutrients are in place to help support this stability of energy production. We also need to do things that promote brain interconnectivity. So a really key player in this process is called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, as well as some other chemicals, but this is really the big powerhouse, the BDNF. And so that chemical is responsible for, it's like miracle grow for your brain, most importantly, the neurons. But it now allows them to interconnect again and to form new dendrites and improves their ability to basically do their job. So things that improve BDNF production are things like exercise. That's one of the most important things, but also a lot of other things can stimulate that. And so we can get more into that in the near future. But so now we have created the landscape for our brain to adapt and to improve. And so now that once we have those foundational features in place, getting good exercise in, making sure that our nutrition is dialed in. So that comes from either a very nutritious diet that covers all the bases, things like magnesium, vitamin B2, CoQ10, and like omega-3s. Those are all some of the biggest ones that we have a lot of evidence to support their value in the migraine management process. But it's also really important to recognize that other foods that help support your general well-being, such as or food substances, not always nutrients. So we like to break things down into our macronutrients, our micronutrients, and our like phytonutrients is another category, or non-nutritive food substances. So that basically means things like fiber. That means things like the colorful chemicals in your food, like phytochemicals, and that's going to be things like in blueberries. That's your anthocyanins, and there's tons of different ones. Like tomatoes have that bright red color. That's a great example of something that has a pretty profound influence on our systemic inflammation. And there are actually literally studies done in people who consume blueberries, for example. People who consume blueberries have reduced inflammatory processes. They also have really incredible changes in cognitive performance. So, we can use some of these really high value foods to enhance our migraine management process because, one of the biggest issues that we encounter is inflammation with migraines, but it's also some of the brain fog and things like that. And so if we know that certain foods can help to augment our lived experience, I think we should absolutely be using those if we can. If you tolerate them, of course. A great example of one that can be kind of hit or miss for some people, depending on their starting point and how long they've been playing around with it, is fiber intake. So fiber has been widely demonstrated to have huge impacts on all sorts of different measures of health. It improves your cholesterol management, your insulin sensitivity, and a lot of different other inflammatory factors. But insulin sensitivity is a really important thing for us to get back to a little bit, in that we rely on insulin for us to manage our blood glucose. And there's literally about two ways for us to do that, to manage blood glucose. One is exercise, and that sucks the blood glucose out of our blood, and it actually, bypasses the insulin mechanism for utilizing blood glucose, which actually means that this is a very powerful tool for us to decrease the load of glucose in our system. And actually, blood glucose, or blood sugar is another way to put that, is actually kind of toxic to our cells when it's not inside of the cell. So when it's in your blood, it actually damages your endothelium, the lining on the inside of your blood vessels. And that is really, really important to understand for very widespread human health issues. So endothelial function is absolutely key for understanding the disease process for things like diabetes, diabetic neuropathy, for migraines as well. So having this improvement in blood glucose management is central to our goals with the migraine management process. So now we can come back into looking at the different food substances again, and so that breaks it down into specific nutrients, into non-nutritive substances, but then we also need to go into the macronutrient category. So in the macronutrients, we need to have kind of a baseline understanding of what those are. So that's carbohydrates, that's fats, and that's proteins. Alcohol kind of falls in that category as well, as far as, it's a significant calorie source. So carbohydrates, those have 4 calories per gram. Proteins have the same calories per gram. So protein and carbohydrates are both 4 calories per gram. But then we have fats, which are 9 calories per gram. And then we have alcohol, which is 7 calories per gram. And the important thing to understand there is that we have this concept called calories in, calories out. And when calories are, we call this caloric balance. So the amount of calories you expend versus the amount of calories that you're consuming. And when you are at neutral or in a slight caloric deficit, that is actually a really great place for our bodies as far as the inflammatory process is concerned. And this is a really helpful thing to understand for a lot of different issues, because caloric surplus, this is, having calories that are more than you're burning, basically leads to changes in inflammation through several different mechanisms. But namely, it's the accumulation of body fat and visceral fat. And what we know from a lot of extensive research in this field is that body fat is actually really, metabolically active, and especially so is visceral fat as well. And these things are really important to manage, because we have, studies that, I was talking about some studies in the general population, but now let's, bring it back to the migraine population. Those people who have migraines on a regular basis and have heightened body weight tend to have more severe migraines, or have, if somebody has more body fat, they tend to have a higher incidence of getting headaches in general. And then we also have studies that look at what happens when you take people who have migraines and are overweight or obese, and you help them lose just a little bit of body fat, between 10 and 15%. That has significant improvements in their migraine burden, the number and severity of migraines that they're having. So understanding this nutrient bubble is super important. But we can then step back out of this puzzle a little bit and get back to the why this is so important. Our migraine brain, our susceptible structures, those are always kind of monitoring what's going on in our body. And so if we don't have the nutrients that are required, the nerves can't do their job very well. If there's too much inflammation from a caloric surplus, it also disrupts this process through we call oxidative processes. And that's, a whole other category we can get into, but we know that these non-nutritive substances, these phytochemicals, help to manage that oxidation process. So they're called antioxidants. And super important to understand this general picture, because we need to make decisions that help us to subtly tweak this and reduce that overall oxidative burden, and that this cascade that influences our brain's ability to produce energy well and to maintain this homeostasis. Because when our brains are not managing this homeostasis very well, through a bunch of different things that can kind of make the threshold for activation of this cortical spreading depression, it kind of lowers the threshold, so it's easier to spill over into the migraine process. And another thing that augments this activity is something that I think is really underappreciated in the migraine management process by a lot of people, ranging from people who have migraines all the way up to the specialists treating migraines, and that is the stress response. So our bodies are constantly kind of trying to mitigate our threat in the environment, and having stress at little intervals is actually kind of helpful for our body. But when we have this low-grade chronic stress that we see a lot in today's day and age, and especially in the American culture, this low-grade chronic stress can actually lower that threshold of brain activity that is required for starting cortical spreading depression. And we've seen this in animal studies, we've seen this in human studies, in stress management, and using strategies like breathing interventions and other mindfulness-based interventions, things like meditation, and other things like exercise, which also help to manage some of the brain stressors that we're exposed to. So making sure that we are able to incorporate things like nutrition, exercise, and stress management are key. These are absolutely foundational to the migraine management process. And this goes back even further to, I've talked about the brain stem area and how that is interconnected with the trigeminal nerve. But another nerve that's really important to note that comes into this brain stem area is the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is a really interesting nerve because it is one of the longest cranial, it's actually the longest cranial nerve. It's not the thickest, but it's the longest. And it actually comes down out of your skull courses down this part of your neck on both sides, and then it goes underneath your collarbones and enters your chest cavity. Then it goes further down into your abdominal cavity. And this is actually responsible for a lot of the what we call autonomic processes of the intestines and the viscera. So really, really important for your digestion and things like that. But it's also, so it's a parasympathetic nerve though. And that's really important to understand, and that increasing the activity of this nerve through things like meditation and stuff can help to both manage some of the gastrointestinal issues that come with migraines, but it's also been shown, because it goes the other way, that this vagus nerve carries information from the brain to the guts, but it also brings information from the guts to the brain. It has sensory and autonomic functions. So when we are able to do things like a very controlled breathing exercise, especially emphasizing the slow exhalation. So breathe in and then slowly let it out. And other breathing patterns can be helpful for this as well. But just emphasizing the slow exhalation for as little as 5 minutes actually has been shown to significantly improve the stress response, but it also improves migraines. So I think it's really valuable to start to recognize that you can make pretty little tweaks to your day to see huge payouts as far as the migraine susceptibility goes. So we've covered those key components, but I think before we leave this brainstem area, it's really important to note to get back to another important convergence process. So I mentioned cervico-trigeminal convergence before. So what we know about the neck and areas associated with the neck, so things like your upper traps and even your shoulders, all of these areas come to the neck and the cervical spinal cord, but especially C1, 2, and 3. So those nerves, that includes the occipital nerve, but it also includes the innervation for all the joints and the soft tissues like the muscles. But it really is important to recognize that there's a ton of innervation in this area, and that if there's irritation going on there, let's say you have, something bothering your neck, whether a joint issue or a muscle issue, it really doesn't matter what it is. If there's something going on there that's telling your brain that your neck's not super safe, it is actually kind of always poking at that trigeminal system because they have a lot of crosstalk going on. So what we need to do is manage some of those neck, jaw, shoulder pain issues. And it really requires a fairly individualized process because no two people have the same kind of pain experience. And it requires kind of breaking down what you're most susceptible to with as far as movement and other triggering factors may go. But it's absolutely possible to improve these different areas and significantly improve that component of the migraine process. So addressing jaw pain, addressing neck pain, addressing their loading susceptibility, their irritability to certain different loading processes. Like let's say running is kind of jarring and you don't have a very strong neck or a very comfortable neck. That can be a trigger for migraines. But a lot of people have, let's say like an old shoulder injury that can cause kind of generalized irritability in this region and absolutely can contribute to the migraine process. But we really also can't forget about the jaw too. That's an important one. Actually, because that's innervated by the same nerve, by the trigeminal nerve. So that is really a big one. If you're having jaw pain and you have migraines, it's absolutely essential that you do something about that. That also kind of carries me forward into oral health. A lot of people actually don't really appreciate that having dental infections, having gum disease, like gingivitis, and other processes going on in your mouth that are kind of pro-inflammatory, that has profound effects on your systemic health. We know that people with oral infections are more susceptible to having hypertension or high blood pressure. They're more likely to have heart disease and other things like joint issues like arthritis and stuff like that. And this process also is intimately connected to the brain. We know now, actually, only in recent years, that the oral microbiome, or the different bacteria and microbes in your mouth play a pretty significant role in the state of your brain. And actually, we have evidence that those microbes can get into the brain area. And that is definitely something we want to take into account. If you're having inflammation in your gums, that is absolutely contributing to inflammation elsewhere. So you're definitely going to want to talk to your dentist if that is something going on. But, also just brush your teeth twice a day at least, floss once a day, do those general things. And your dietary choices also influence your oral health. But, I'm not a dentist, so probably talk to the dental health professionals and get that oral infection managed. If you get bleeding gums or if you have an old root canal that still gives you trouble, like that's a pretty significant thing to keep in mind. So now if we kind of zoom out and we look at a lot of the things that I've mentioned, and this is absolutely not comprehensive, there are a lot of other things that go into this, but if we zoom out and really look at what it means to address these things, it means that we need to actually facilitate, create systems that help support behavior change. Because in reality, if you just like brush your teeth a couple times, you don't manage that oral infection. Or if you just eat a healthy meal once, that doesn't really change that long-standing brain, gut, body interaction. And I think it's really important to understand that we need to approach this from a long-term behavior change approach. And what that means is, we have to slowly over time integrate different changes to your day-to-day life. That, if you aren't exercising at all and you realize like, oh, I need to actually try to meet the ACSM guidelines, which are 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity cardiovascular endurance training, or 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity cardiovascular endurance training. And those actually go up to 300 minutes of moderate intensity and 150 minutes of vigorous intensity. And actually, the closer you get to that upper number on each of those, the more value you get. So it's actually a kind of pretty significant range, but the more you do, the better actually for migraine management and for general health, managing cardiovascular disease, managing the issues of like frailty and bone density loss and muscle mass loss as you age and you progress through life. So exercise is huge, but that's not just cardio, it's also 2 days per week of resistance training. So if we go from no exercise whatsoever, or maybe you walk at the grocery store sometimes, and we say, we're gonna meet all those numbers, that is not sustainable. We need a slow progressive improvement in your understanding of why you need exercise, understanding how it fits into your lifestyle, understanding what it means to identify as somebody who exercises. Like that's actually essential for making lasting change, is to kind of make shifts in not only what you're doing, but also like why you're doing it and what you identify as a person. If you're somebody like, I don't exercise, it's too hard, then you're very likely not going to immediately pick up on an exercise routine. But if you start to recognize like, oh, I feel better when I exercise regularly, or like at the baseline, you just, when you walk every day or something like that, or you get some exercise snacks in at first, you're like, wow, this is really elevating my quality of life. Then you can start to kind of immerse in it a little bit more. And you maybe over time, over the course of months to even thinking of this in the span of years sometimes, in that, if you just started now, it takes time to get that established and make it second nature. So we have a lot of different things that our scientific literature has shown us will help facilitate behavior change and make it stick, versus just kind of random efforts at the stuff that we know is valuable. Because if we say like, oh, we know it's important to eat a healthy diet that's rich in fiber, rich in phytonutrients, and rich in protein, and all of these things that we know are helpful for migraines, then, and for just general health, then if we try to implement all that at once while you're exercising more, while you're doing all these things, and you don't have a system in place to make this actually work for you and to really help to ground it in reality, in what you can do right now to make sure that in tomorrow you're still sticking with it, and you're still sticking with it at 6 months, that is absolutely critical to understand. So we can rely on a lot of different lines of scientific evidence for making this migraine recovery process actually stick. Having somebody to keep you accountable, making sure that you're making, a select few efforts that are going to incorporate into the bigger picture, but focusing on a few, like 1 to 3 things at a time, and sustaining those for months is a great foundational approach. And you can really do a little bit more if you actually have somebody that you're working with, because having a coach really helps to keep you accountable, and it helps to make sure that your efforts aren't governed by your amount of motivation. Because if you have a system in place where you meet once a week or every other week or something like that, or you follow a program and you have a community of people that you kind of interact with on a regular basis, that can really help to make sure that you're feeling like you're supported in this process. Because we literally have papers that look at the effect of a community on people trying to integrate changes for their migraines. And so what we find is that actually having the ability to have a community while you're going through these changes improves your outcomes. It improves the number of migraine days you reduce. It improves the severity and all these things, because we can even dial back. Like, let's just say you didn't have migraines and you're just trying to improve your fitness. We know that having a personal trainer is better than doing it with a friend, which is better than doing it alone. So the more guidance that you have, or the more kind of consistent support strategies that you utilize, that influences your outcomes, and it influences the little things here and there that kind of govern how much you're doing, which ultimately is what is going to allow you to see change. Because if you keep doing what you're doing now, there's a very good chance you're not going to see any changes, and you're going to be doing the exact same thing a year from now. But if you make these subtle shifts and you recognize that, like, actually establishing support systems is absolutely crucial to this process, and understanding why it is we're doing exactly what we're doing and putting that into the context of your life is profoundly valuable. So, that's actually the 7th pillar of what I call the 7 pillars of Migraine Renaissance, or just the 7 pillars of migraine management, whatever you want to call it. That is at the foundation. If you can find a way to make lasting change that actually works for you, you are going to evolve in ways that you never thought possible. So, I think we will talk a lot more about the other little tricks and tips in this podcast as we go. And I think you'll find that starting to get a bigger picture as to what's happening with your migraines, what you can do about that, and how you can make that stick in your life is a complete game changer. So, all right, that's it for today. We will tune back in next week. But if you like what you're hearing and you want to listen again, please give us a follow. If you know somebody who has migraines and you think this would help them, please share it with them. And you can always subscribe too. I think that's a really good strategy for helping people, for learning a little bit more about the stuff, or let's just say you want to have a couple knowledge points to help your friend out when they're in a pinch. I think that could be a great strategy as well. But anyways, we'll talk to you soon. Have a nice day.